For decades, we've operated under a central truth when it comes to the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. But what happens when that established fact, a truth built almost entirely on data from Western populations, is tested against the deep, diverse genetic landscape of Africa? Well, a long-held certainty starts to crumble, and it reveals a story that is far more complex and, frankly, far more fascinating.
All right, let's get into it. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the gene that became the gold standard for Alzheimer's risk. Then, we'll look at the Nigerian paradox that really challenged its power. We'll explore why this divergence happens and identify a more potent risk factor in African populations. Then we'll see how these genes actually work together, and finally, what this all means for the future of genomics.
So first, we really need to understand the foundational belief that has guided, countless research projects and clinical trials in Alzheimer's for more than 30 years. At the very heart of this story is one specific gene variant, apolipoprotein epsilon 4, or as we'll call it, APOE epsilon 4. For years, in study after study, mostly involving people of European ancestry, carrying this one allele was shown to dramatically increase a person's risk of developing late-onset Alzheimer's. The scientific consensus on this was, overwhelming. APOE epsilon 4 wasn't just a risk factor. For all intents and purposes, it was considered the primary risk factor. It became the benchmark, the universal predictor that everything else was measured against. But as it turns out, this universal truth was about to face its biggest challenge yet. Now, our story takes a pretty dramatic turn. We're shifting our focus to West Africa, and specifically to the Yoruba people of Ibadan, Nigeria.
You see, this exact question was at the core of the Indianapolis Ibadan Dementia Project. This was a really important comparative study looking at Alzheimer's in two populations that are genetically related but live in very different environments: African Americans in the US and Yoruba Nigerians. And the results? They were completely unexpected. So what's so interesting here is the profound disconnect this data reveals. The APOE epsilon 4 allele was found at similar rates in both groups, but its power to predict Alzheimer's, it practically vanished in the Nigerian cohort. It's also worth pointing out the lower overall incidence rates in Ibadan. Now, while we're focused on genetics, that does hint that environmental factors like diet or social structures might be playing a protective role. But from a purely genomic perspective, the gold standard had failed. So this Nigerian paradox was basically a scientific bombshell. It forced researchers to ask a really critical question. Why would the exact same gene behave so differently in two populations that share a common ancestry? Well, the answer lies deep within the very fabric of the human genome. And this is the crucial point. Genetic context matters a lot. The human genome isn't some uniform blueprint. African populations have this incredible genetic variation, which suggests that other genes, maybe protective factors developed over thousands of years, could be interacting with and changing the effect of APOEF4. We can even see this happening within admixed populations like African Americans. Using a technique called local genomic ancestry, scientists found that the risk from an APOE4 allele is actually weaker if it's sitting on a piece of DNA inherited from an African ancestor compared to one from a European ancestor. So, in a way, the gene's neighborhood actually changes its behavior. So if APOE epsilon 4 isn't the main driver of genetic risk in people of African ancestry, then what is? This question led researchers to look at another gene, one that's also involved in how the body handles lipids, ABCA7. And this table just illustrates the genomic divergence perfectly. Certain variants in the ABCA7 gene are way more potent in individuals of African ancestry. They increase the odds of developing Alzheimer's by 70 to 80%. That's a huge effect size, one that puts ABCA7 right on par with, or maybe even above, APOE epsilon 4 as a key risk factor in this population. The reason ABCA7 is such a critical player is because it's right at the center of the very mechanisms that go wrong in Alzheimer's. It helps manage cholesterol in the brain, it helps clear out the toxic amyloid beta proteins that form plaques, and it helps regulate the brain's own immune response. So if something goes wrong here, the consequences are profound. But the plot thickens even more. This isn't just a simple story of one gene replacing another. It's actually about a dangerous partnership, a synergistic effect where these two genes can interact and really accelerate the disease process.
What researchers discovered was that when specific risk variants in ABCA7 are inherited along with the APOE epsilon 4 allele, they don't just add to the risk, they seem to multiply it. And the most devastating impact is on when the disease actually starts.
And this right here, this is the clinical impact put into numbers. On average, people with this double hit of genetic risk develop the disease a full 5 years earlier. In the context of a progressive neurodegenerative illness, 5 years, that is an enormous loss of healthy, cognitive life for a person and for their entire family. This chart just shows how powerful that synergy really is. If you look at the hazard ratio, which is a measure of risk over time, you can see that for someone carrying one copy of APOE4, the risk is already high. But you add in a specific ABCA7 deletion that's common in African ancestry populations, and that risk for an earlier onset nearly doubles. So after unraveling all of this complex interplay of ancestry and genetics, what's the ultimate lesson here? What does this mean for how we approach Alzheimer's and other complex diseases from now on? The crucial takeaway is this. Our understanding of human disease has been dangerously incomplete because our data has been overwhelmingly homogeneous. If we want to create effective diagnostics, preventative strategies, and treatments that actually work for everyone, our research simply has to reflect the full, rich spectrum of global human diversity. You know, the Nigerian Paradox doesn't just rewrite the genetic map for Alzheimer's. It forces us to ask a much broader, much more profound question. It challenges the entire scientific community to really consider what other fundamental truths about human health are just waiting to be discovered, hidden in plain sight, within the genomes of the very populations we have for far too long overlooked.